world and everything. Just thank you for your service, and it inspires young guys like me every day. That I got 40 years, and after that I can still kick butt. So give him one more clap. So we have been talking about the good fight of faith. Someone say, good fight of faith. Pastor Tim preached an amazing sermon last week. How many of you are here for that? Man, he can just inspire the crap out of you. I mean, he really can. And I've been thinking about it all week. Again, welcome, Facebook. Give a clap to everyone on Facebook who has been watching. Last week, we had over 10,000 people that watched last sermon. So thank you for joining us on Sunday. And it's really been on my mind, the fight of faith. Pastor Tim mentioned that each one of us are in a battle. Someone say battle. And we go through all kinds of battles. Some battles are small, some battles are large. Some don't last very long, some last years. But despite the battles we go through, there are principles that we can learn in order to work through. How many think that's a good idea? Last week, Pastor Tim talked about what it meant to work your land. Someone say, work your land. It's amazing how far you can get when you're just willing to work. You don't have to be the smartest. You don't have to be the most gifted. You don't have to be the most talented. It's one of the things that I've seen. I have, in my life, I've known a lot of very educated people, just even through my, when I was going through my master's program and other things. But one of the things that I've noticed is that despite a lot of folks with a lot of education, it often is the workers who really make it. They're the ones who, as we say, they out-hustle the smarts. Because you can be as smart as you can be the smartest person in the world, but if you're not willing to put the time in and work your land, how many of you know you're not going to go anywhere? You are just not going to go anywhere. And so today, in order to piggyback off of what Tim was talking about, today I want to talk about the importance and the power of standing up. Someone say standing up in a down moment. Because we've all gone through down moments. How many of you would agree? And if you live long enough, you're going to have a down moment. One of the greatest things about being 28 is when you see a good-looking 18-year-old who is super talented, and they're just going to create the world and do awesome. And 10 years down the line, you're looking at them and say, I'm so happy for you, but man, just wait until you're 22 and life decides to hit you really hard. Because it's over the next 10, 20 years that you're going to figure out, do you have the stuff? Right? So how do we learn how to stand tall in down moments? Because that is really half the battle. I'm sure many of you have heard the saying before that showing up is 80% of the battle. I remember coaches would say that to me all the time, trainers would say that to me all the time, and it's so true. Now as a pastor I can testify, showing up is 80% of the battle. If you can show up, you might not have it all together, but if you can show up, if you can get it in you to show up. And it matters a lot. And if you can master how to just show up and what it means to stand, you don't even have to run yet. You don't even have to walk yet. But if you can learn what it means to stand, you will survive any down moment. And for me, that really is what the fight of faith is about. It's about learning to stand. So what better way to talk about this than on Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend? How many are excited for MLK Day on Monday? Give that a clap. And I want to talk about him. There's certain people that inspire you. For me, Martin Luther King is one of them. And of course, everyone knows who he is. Some people get really into his work, others don't. I always say there's the Disneyland version, right, that we learn every year in school, and then there's like the real version, the person. And one of the things that was so amazing about him, which a lot of people don't know, and they forget about this, is that he was a pastor. And he started in the church. And he lived his life in the church. Throughout the entire civil rights movement, he was always a pastor. He would preach most Sundays. A lot of people don't know that. And what a lot of people also don't know is that in 1955, when the Montgomery boycott started, Martin Luther King was only 26 years of age. How many of you knew that? Nobody. 26. I'm 28. He is 26 years old. And it's a really incredible story. Martin came from a good family. His grandfather was a pastor. His father was a pastor. He grew up at a church called Ebenezer in Atlanta. And he was an associate pastor under his dad. His dad famously was a very strong man of faith. And he affected Martin's life. He was a really strong man in the community. Everyone knew who his father was. And he was there. And he also had, by the time he was 26, 3 degrees, including his doctorate. And he was finishing up his doctorate while he was 26. And he had just moved to Montgomery because he wanted to move outside of the umbrella of his dad and take over his own church. And it was Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that he took over in Montgomery, which was one of the biggest churches in the area. And it was known for being the kind of place you could see there that you'd want to go to church in. So here's this young pastor, 26, PhD in systematic theology from Boston University. Just started his career, had just gotten married to Coretta, and was waiting for his first child. And he was only a pastor for 12 to 15 months by the time Rosa Parks decided that she would not move off of the row she was sitting at on the bus. And as a lot of people know the famous story, the way that it worked in Montgomery was you had a section on the bus for African Americans and a section on the bus for whites. And if the white portion was overcrowded, and you had to have a white person sit in the black section, what they would do is they would move the whole row. They had a rule that no black and white person could sit on the same row. So even if there was a full row, they would make everybody move. And so Rosa Parks was sitting, and they had asked her to give her seat up, and she said no. So, of course, that did not go over well. She was arrested that day, and a lot of people in the neighborhood knew who Rosa Parks was, so it was a really big deal. And when she was arrested, a lot of local leaders immediately started thinking about how they would respond, because this was a big issue at the time. So local leaders had come together, and they were deciding how they wanted to handle this, because they knew that they wanted to protest in some way, but they didn't know who would lead. So they all got together, and they chose a fresh face, a young minister from Atlanta who had only been in town 15 months. So they asked him to be the spokesperson. Of course, King obliged. He decided to take that position. And so they were off to the races. They started deciding how to put on the Montgomery boycott. And it was interesting as I was reading and I was studying this, because I'm a history nerd. How many of you just are history nerds? I want to know everything. what was so fascinating to me was that when they were originally putting together the boycott, they weren't asking for full equality. All they wanted was that if the white section on the bus was packed, that they wanted the rules changed where they wouldn't require African Americans in their section to give up their seat. That's all the first request was. And it was actually such a small request that at the time, most local leaders thought that the city and the bus department would actually give in under a week. It was supposed to be a small protest. They did not think that it would go long. They didn't prepare for it to go long. It started as a few meetings at Dexter Church, Dexter Avenue, as well as a few other churches in the area, and they started meeting, and they planned this, and they gave the city the demands, and they were ready to take on the battle. Someone say battle. But how many of you know that in life, often when you decide to start to stand up for something, life is about to hit you? Almost always. You try to change the universe, you think the universe is changing for you? How many of you guys have tried to go on diets before? I remember one time, I have this really funny story. I remember one time it was like a New Year's resolution, and I decided to go on a diet. And for the first week, I was like, I'm going to eat so clean. So I made this pot of stew, and it was full of onions and tomatoes. And so for 1 week, all I ate was this like tomato chili paste, and there was so much acid in it that I ended up getting so much heartburn that I had to go to the doctor, and my doctor put me on a diet of white pasta and white rice for the week. Someone say the universe pushes back at you. Edward's looking at me. True story. True story. I think I gained weight after the first 2 weeks. But it's often the case that when you try to change something around you, even when you think it's going to be small, even when it's something that's incremental, it often never goes the way that you think. And most often, it's a bigger fight and harder than you think it will be. And that's what happened to them. They started the boycott, and they thought, and you see it in their notes, and even when they were speaking, everybody thought that the city would give in. It was such a small request, and 3 other local cities in Alabama had similar asks, and they had changed the rules. So why not Montgomery? But that did not happen. The city froze them out. Thanks. The city froze them out. 1 month later, still no response. 2 months later, still no response. And they did not know what to do. There's a journal entry, and I want to read this. And this was a month after all this had happened, and the city was not responding. And Dr. King, after speaking at a church, was arrested for the first time really in his life. It was 3 weeks after the boycott has started. And there he is, getting arrested. Look how young he looks. He's only 26. And it had a big impact on his life, and it scared him because even though he was living in 1955 in that part of the country, for all intents and purposes, he had a pretty good life up until that point. He was educated. His father was a big-name pastor in the area. He had, even during the Depression, he had been okay. His family had gotten through because they were senior pastors of a big black church in Atlanta. So for all intents and purposes, even though he was living in that period and he had dealt with some things, he had never been in a position where he was arrested. And so slowly after that, he goes home. It's the day after. And he started getting calls, and around 20 times a day, he would get threatening calls on his life, which was new to him. And he says in his notes, he goes, I was ready to give up, he said. Quote, with my cup of coffee sitting untouched before me, I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing a coward. In other words, this isn't what I signed up for. I thought I would just help lead this one boycott. I didn't realize that it was going to turn into this thing. I thought it was only going to last 2 weeks. I didn't realize it would go on months. All I want to do is pastor a local church for the first time in my life with my new family. I didn't know I was going to have to carry this movement and be the face of it for the nation. I'm only 26. And so he talks about this moment. He was at home, and it was the day after he was arrested, and it was midnight at night, and he could not sleep. And he says it was around midnight, thinking back on it. You can have some strange experiences at midnight. That's what he said. And he reflected on the threatening call that had come in earlier that day. And the caller said, we are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of town in 3 days, we are going to blow your brains out and blow up your house. Imagine being 26, trying to pastor, and you have to come home every night. He goes, I sat there, and I thought of a beautiful little daughter who had just been born. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in at night after night and to see that little gentle smile. And I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken away from me any minute. I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was over there asleep. And she could be taken from me. Or I could be taken from her. And I got to that point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. Something said to me, you can't call on Daddy now. You can't even call on Mama now. They're up in Atlanta, 175 miles away. You've got to call on that something in that person that your daddy used to tell you about. The power that can make a way where there was no way. And I discovered then, he writes, that religion had to become real to me. And I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I will never forget it. I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to be weak. And this is the moment that changed his life forever. And it seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. Stand up for righteousness. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. I heard the voice of Jesus saying to still fight on. He promised never to leave me. Never to leave me alone. And that moment changed his life. And he will often refer to it at the worst times over the next 12 years. That what gave him the boldness to act was the knowledge that it wasn't by his own strength to stand. that it was through God that gave him strength. And he knew why he had to do what he had to do. He knew why he had to stand. He knew why he had to get up. He knew why he could not sit back in his age. He knew why he could not sit back even in the privileges that his family had afforded him. That God was calling him to a risky place to take chances for something bigger than his own security. Something bigger than his own happiness. Something bigger than the opportunities that his career as a big-name pastor might afford him. I believe that that is the price to follow Jesus. Amen? And I believe this, before you can follow, you've got to learn how to stand. How many of you would agree to that? And it's so true. Before you can follow, you got to learn the mechanics of how to just stand. And I think that's what it means to live a life of faith. It's to live a life on your feet. It's to find out who you are in God and to become that person. The greatest gift we have, I believe, is the potential. There's a really famous Lutheran theologian from Yale, and I remember one time they asked him, he goes, why did Jesus wait so long? You have Jesus, and now we're waiting, right? 2,000 years ago, the resurrection happened. Why is he giving us all this time? How come Jesus has not returned? And he gave it a really brilliant answer, and I never forget it. And you know, sometimes you hear an answer, and you've thought about it for 10 years, and different times in your life, it'll come back up, and you'll rethink of that, and you're like, man, that is like truer today than it was yesterday. And he said, the reason why Jesus has waited is because he has afforded us the opportunity to become his people. And when I first heard that, I didn't get what it meant, because I was 18. And when you're 18, how are you supposed to know how that means? But at 28, I get it a little bit more. The greatest gift we have been given is the potential to follow. We are given a life so we that might build the life. We are given a journey so we might walk out the journey, right? We are given positions of leadership so that we might rise to the position of being worthy of being a leader. We have been given the opportunity to become a person of God in a people of God. We have been given the space to rise, to become something, to mean something. And I believe this, when you stand, you're saying three things. The first thing is you're saying, I will face. Say, I will face. The second thing you're saying is, I will bear. Say, I will bear. And the third thing you're saying is, I will overcome. I will overcome. Whenever you stand, those are the three things that you're communicating. I will face, I will bear, I will overcome. And how many of you would agree that what better blueprint than to live a life? What better way to go about fighting the fight of faith? What better way to go about meeting your challenges in your mountains? Face, bear, overcome. I want to read Philippians 1:27. This is Paul. And just like in the book of Ephesians, Paul is still in prison. And the church of Philippi, I mentioned this one time before, that back in the day when you were in prison, the only way to eat and to give things were actually if someone sent you money or supplies. They wouldn't just give it to you if you were in prison during that time. So, as many of you know, the book of Ephesians was written because the church in Ephesus had sent someone to go and deliver money for Paul, and the church of Philippi is doing the same thing. So they have gone there, and they had given Paul some money so that he might be able to eat. And he is writing to them. And he says, what happens? Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy, someone say worthy, of the gospel of Jesus. Then, whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm. Someone say, stand firm. In one spirit, striving together as the one for the gospel without being frightened in any by those who oppose you. Anything worth fighting for, I believe that you're going to have to face some fears along the way. How many of you would agree? I remember when I was a kid and my parents, I believe it was my mother. I hope I get the story right because they're both watching. They were trying to teach me how to boogie board, and I remember I was seeing all these other kids, and it looked so fun, so I begged my mom to finally teach me, and I get out there, and I'm waiting for the wave, and I'm super excited because you're 5 and you're excited, and the first wave came and hit me. Bam! It knocked my butt to the ground. I came up crying, and I was over it. I was like, Mom, thank you for the opportunity, but I'm good. I think there's some lemonade in the cooler. I'm going to go do that for a while. You can deal with all this boogie board mess. You are 4 times my size, so I won't take it too personal, ego-wise. But it's often like that. And I remember I was like not having it. Oof. And when I don't want to have it, Greg, I don't have it. Like, it's bad. Like, I was not in the mood. And my mom, if any of you guys know my mother, she can be a little pushy when you're not moving. So she stood there and gave me the brown mom stare and was like, you are gonna overcome this. You're gonna ride that wave if it's the last thing you do. Seeing that there was no way out of the situation, I decided to try. And thank the Lord, I rode the stinking wave. But it taught me a lesson that anything worth doing, you got to overcome some fear. One of the things that they will teach you in psychology, if cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is like the most common if you're a psychologist or if you go and get some therapy, what they'll tell you is if you're dealing with anxiety or something related to fear, they won't take away the fear. They'll try to make you braver. And it makes a lot of sense because most of the things we're fearful about, like a lot of them, like there's reasons to be fearful. Like life will kick you. Don't get kicked. Like, it's dangerous, right? Like life is dangerous at times. And so, you're not going to be in a position to take the danger away. But what you can do is you can be braver. You can become braver. And that's what they'll do, almost always. So if you have a fear of something, what they'll do is they'll expose it to you. They'll say, if you have a fear of elevators, they'll say, walk to the elevator. Don't ride it, but walk to it. And then you do that, and then they say, did you die? And then you'll say, no. And you say, okay, now touch the elevator and see what happens. And you do that. And what are they doing? They're making you braver. Someone say braver. To overcome the fear, because the fear is real. But your only option is to get brave. And the second thing they'll do is they'll only make you do it, but it has to be voluntary. You have to volunteer. And we see this as a biblical example. It makes a lot of sense. It's interesting that psychological idea is present in Scripture. And we see it in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus is sweating blood and he's thinking about what he's got to do. And he meets God and says, do I really got to do this? Is there a shortcut way? Can we get to the resurrection with all that other stuff? And the Father says to Jesus, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially he says, yeah, you don't have to do this. I mean, sure, you don't have to do it, but there's consequences if you don't do it. And it's the same thing with fear. You don't have to face your fear. You don't have to face the things in your life that are bugging you or that you're avoiding. I mean, you don't have to do it. But if you don't, you won't see the resurrection. You won't get to the victory if you're not willing to face the fear. Because you have to go through it. And the second thing that happens when we stand, first one is that when we stand, we face. Say face. The second thing you do is that when we stand, we bear. To bear something. People often refer to Martin Luther King Jr. as one of the greatest people that ever lived. And I think that's probably true. But why do they say that? It's because if you think about it, the people that we describe as great, whether it be Martin Luther King Jr., whether it be, Nelson Mandela, almost always what we're talking about is a person who's capable or they bore a heavy load. They were put in a situation where it would have been easier for them and more expedient for them to opt out. It was in their interest, so to speak, to opt out, but they decided not to opt out. They decided to bear some heavy weights for something bigger than themselves. Which means what? It means a life of greatness is a life full of responsibility, which a lot of people don't think about. Because we often think of greatness as talent. I feel like in the most modern sense of the word, when we go through a sales seminar and they say be great, what they're often talking about is talent, or they're talking about meeting some success goal. But true, I think, greatness, and if we really look at it, if you search your soul and you see the people, if you think about your parents or people in your life, almost always what you're seeing is you gravitate towards people who lived up to great responsibilities and overcame them. That in the midst of really having to bear some things, they transcended the responsibilities they took on. There's a psychologist named Jordan Peterson that I like to quote sometimes, and they ask him a lot, especially young men. They say, Dr. Peterson, what's the secret to living a meaningful life? And the first thing he says is he goes, well, it's not happiness, that's for sure. Because, first of all, you're probably not going to be happy all the time, because someone somewhere will get sick and you will be in a bad situation. So if your goal is happiness, good luck. Because if you're happy now, God bless you. But you're probably going to have to deal with some things in the future, and you're not going to be very happy about it. So if that's your goal, you're going to fail miserably. Well, if it's not happiness, then what is it? And he says that you want to live a life that's worth it. And what does that mean, to live a life that's worth it? That means that even though you suffered, it was still something you would do again. That you would do it again. That even though you went through things, it was still worth the suffering. And it's such a good piece of insight. And where do you get that then? Well, where does that lead you to? Well, it leads you to responsibility. So you have a meaningful life when you decide to be a father. And you take on the responsibility, right, of fatherhood. Or if you're an entrepreneur, you become an entrepreneur when you decide to take the responsibility of an enterprise. It takes the experience of saying, I'm going to go after this, I'm going to go after this, I'm going to choose this, I'm going to be responsible for it. No matter what happens, I'm going to show up day in and day out. I'm going to be responsible. In other words, I'm going to pick a rock up and lift it And the bigger the rock, the more greatness. Number 2, for the importance of bearing. One of the things I love about that story, and when Martin Luther King talks about that experience, it's really a story about picking up your cross. And what's so incredible is that Jesus tells him that, pick up your cross and I will be with you. Pick up your cross and I will be with you. Or to put it a different way, lower yourself, Martin, to where I am, and I will be with you. And it's such an incredible piece of insight, because we often think about, where do we find Jesus? And I talk to a lot of young people that say they don't see Jesus in the church. And I say, why don't you make the decision to serve? And they're always thrown off, because they're like, didn't you just hear me? Like, they're expecting me to sell them on something. And I say, are you serving? Like, why don't you serve? And they always look at me kind of funny, like, I just told you that I'm not feeling it. And I go, yeah. But if you're looking for Jesus, why don't you go to the place where he is? If you're looking for love, why don't you go to the place of love? If you're looking for grace, why don't you go to the place of grace and put yourself there? Do you know what I mean? It's like we want to see these things. Well, yes, but go to the place and you'll see them. Put yourself in a faith position where you have to use faith, and you will see faith. You will see the grace of God in those places. And we see it in Philippians 1:27, where Paul continues. He goes, this is a sign to them that they will not be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God, for it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also suffer for him. Since you are going through the same struggles that I had, now hear that I still have them. In other words, it's through the suffering that we become something of value. If you're in the army, or if you're a person who went to the army, that's one of the things they do before. Is the first thing they do through base camp is they strip you. And it's often the same if you're a musician, or if you're doing anything. I experience, even I think, working with Tim, and Tim has been, when he first started teaching me how to preach, is you go through a process of realizing that you suck. You know what I mean? You have to realize that you're clay, and that you need to spend some time working yourself out and being humble about it. That maybe you don't have it all figured out. Maybe you got 3 out of 10 things right, but maybe with some work, you could get 4 out of 10 things right in about 6 months. And that's what it takes, and that's one lesson I've learned working with Pastor Tim, is just the sheer amount of work and the price that man has paid over 30 years. This is a kind of a funny story. So right after Tim got Oprah, everyone, of course, was bugging him about it. And I remember we just had started the church, and I had a friend of mine who was a pastor who was my age. He was like trying to be a traveling evangelist. And, when you're young, you see a lot of people going into ministry. And I would say that 6 out of 10 are going in for the right reasons. But it's shocking how many young people, it's like they see the end of the road, and they're like, I want to be that guy. And they don't last very long. They don't. Because, they realize that ministry is, really hard work, and, no one pays you anything, and you just, you know what I mean? And, you just love on people. And if you don't like loving on people, it is the wrong career for you. I'm telling you. It's just, do not do it. Go work on Wall Street. Get an assistant. Because for about 20 years, you are not going to get it. So you got to love what you do. And I remember my buddy, and, he was just, God bless him, but he was just up in himself a little bit. And he called me, and I was like, hey, man, how you doing? Like, doing well? He goes, hey, so I have this idea for a new Christian talk show. And it wasn't a great idea, but I didn't want to say anything. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And he goes, hey, so I know that I got to call in the big call, man. I'm thinking, big call? Who do I know? Like, what is... And he goes, so I'm wondering if you can get me to Oprah. And I just stared at him like, you are the dumbest person I've ever met. You think I know Oprah? Do you know what I mean? You meet some, really dumb people. And I just remember thinking, I was trying to be nice, but I was like, first of all, no. Number two, you might want to try to get financing for your show first. Let's not skip to level 100. Why don't you just start with writing a script? Because everybody wants to get there. Everyone is looking for that fast breakthrough. And I've learned this, and can you guys take 3 more minutes? And this is something I've really learned because I've thought about this a lot, and the concept of breakthrough. And I think that there's a real secret to it, because after spending as much time as I have watching guys like Pastor Tim and so many other men in the faith and women in the faith who've experienced those breakthroughs, almost always what you'll find, and people don't tell you this, but when most people talk about breakthrough, what they're looking for is they're looking for the over. It's like they want to skip the hard stuff. That's why they're looking. But what they don't realize, and you see it in the Bible, that in order to get to the resurrection, you got to go through the cross. You got to be willing to voluntarily suffer for your dream. You have to be willing to voluntarily face the fear of it not working and saying, you know what, I'm going to put myself in a position where in 2 years from now, I'm going to have to be a different person than what I am now in order to make that. And you have to become. And I close with this. Greg, if you could come up. I just want to read this, Philippians 4:10, because Paul is in the same situation. He has been preaching for so many years, and he is in prison, and he's been writing to the church of Philippi, and he says something that'll really change your life. If you can really get it in you, it'll change your life. He goes, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. In other words, thank you for thinking about me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content. Someone say content. Whatever the circumstances. How many of you have been there? You know what that's like. I know what it means to be in need. I also know what it means to have plenty. And he goes, through all that I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I do all this through him who gives me strength. The secret to learning how to stand, even in a down moment, is to know who made you and who your Heavenly Father is. And when you know that, man, watch out for the potential that can come out of you. It's just like Martin Luther King says, He says, stand up for truth, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice. And Jesus told me, I will never be alone. Why is that? Because he's in the struggle. When we have to bear our crosses, when we have to pick things up, when we have to look at retirement and say, I am not done yet. I still have more in me. I still can be more. I still can become more. I'm going to pick up this cross. I'm going to pick up my burden, and I'm going to walk with it. And it's not going to kill me. It's going to make me stronger. Why? Because as I bear my cross, Jesus bears his right alongside me. I'm done preaching. Give the Lord a clap. If everyone could just stand with me. And if I could have the